G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Faith Foundations. And today we'll be looking at the 8 covenants of the Bible. Welcome to this session of the 8 covenants. Tonight we're going to look at the Mosaic Covenant. That will take the whole session. Last time we looked at the Edenic, the Adamic, the Noahic, and the Abrahamic covenants. And tonight we're looking at the Mosaic Covenant. Now, what is the Mosaic Covenant? We see that the scriptures that cover that are in Exodus 20 verse 1 to Deuteronomy 28 verse 68. Now, who are the participants in the Mosaic Covenant? The parties involved in this, it's God and Israel. It was made with Israel. Not just with Moses. So the covenant was made with Israel, with Moses acting as the representative of Israel. And we see that in Exodus chapter 19, verse 3 to 8, where it says Exodus 19, verse 3 to 8, and Moses went up unto God, and Jehovah called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be mine own possession from among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests, and a holy mountain, a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak unto the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and set before them all these words which Jehovah commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, All that Jehovah has spoken we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people unto Jehovah. So this covenant was made with Israel only. It was not made with the Gentiles. It was not made with the church. Israel only. We also see that point in Deuteronomy 4, 7 to 8, and Psalm 147, 19 to 20, and Malachi 4, 4. So first up, Israel and God. Now, what are the provisions in this covenant? The key provision of the Mosaic Covenant was the law of Moses, which contained a total of 613 commandments. And involved in these provisions of the law were blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. Now, this covenant was signed and sealed by the Shekinah glory in Exodus 24, verses 1 to 11, but it was signed in such a way that rendered the covenant conditional. So, in essence, what we see here is that there are 613 provisions of the covenant. There's too many of them to get through tonight. We're going to look at 7 observations that we can make from this. And the first one is that, first of all, we know that we said that there are 613 specific commandments, not just 10. And most people think it's just 10, 10 commandments, that's all. And of these 613, 365 of them were negative commandments, which were things which were forbidden. 248 were positive commandments, things that should be done. This was also a conditional covenant. What does that mean? It means something like this. If God says do this and I will bless you, don't do this and I will curse you. So it's conditioned upon obedience. There would be blessings for obedience, but there would also be judgment for disobedience. And we see this provision here in Exodus 15, 26, and there in 19, verse 3 to 8, which we just read. In this covenant, we have a blood sacrifice, and the key element of the entire Mosaic covenant was the blood sacrifice. And this is brought in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, where it says that, For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life. So in this, we see that blood is the means of atonement. And we see also that there are 5 different types of offerings. in Leviticus chapters 1 to 7. Now, we need to remember here that the Hebrew word for atonement does not mean the removal of sin, but simply the covering of sin. So the blood sacrifices covered sin. While the blood of animals covered the sins of the Old Testament saints, it never took those sins away. Only the blood of Messiah Jesus, can remove those sins. And we see that in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 to 4. In Hebrews 10, verse 4, it is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. But what the blood sacrifices did provide was for the forgiveness of sin and the restoration of fellowship. So that was the purpose of the blood sacrifices. We also see that there are some diet restrictions imposed upon the nation. It restricted some of the provisions that came out of the Noahic Covenant. In these restrictions, now the beasts had to be both cloven hoofed, and those that chewed the cud, these are the ones you can eat. Fish had to have both fins and scales. No birds of prey were allowed to be eaten. Insects, there's only one type of locust was permitted, and that was a type that John the Baptist ate when he was in the wilderness. We also see here that the death penalty is now expanded because for the Jews, the added death penalty for such things as idolatry, adultery, cursing God, cursing parents, breaking the Sabbath, practicing witchcraft. So these are just some of the laws that require the death penalty. So these were added. Now, what we see here is that the Mosaic Covenant reaffirmed the practice of circumcision. We see that in Leviticus 12, verse 3, but it wasn't for the same reasons as the Abrahamic Covenant. Under the Abrahamic Covenant, circumcision was the sign of the covenant, and it was mandatory for Jews. Now, under the Mosaic Covenant, circumcision was the means of submission to the law of Moses, and it was mandatory for all Jews, but also for any Gentiles who wished to become part of the Commonwealth of Israel. And that's why Paul, down in Galatians chapter 5, verse 3, he warned the Gentile Galatian believers that if they submitted to circumcision, they'd be obliged to keep the whole law, not just this one commandment. So circumcision, it was a sign of the Abrahamic covenant. It was mandatory for Jews, but in the Mosaic covenant, it was a sign of submission to the law of Moses. Now, what's the token of the covenant of Moses? The token or sign of the Mosaic covenant was the Sabbath. And we can see out of the scriptures 5 specific observations can be made. First of all, being the token of the Mosaic covenant, it was a sign between God and Israel. It was a sign that Israel had been set apart by God. And we see this in Exodus 31, verses 12 to 17. It was a sign of the Exodus. We see that in Deuteronomy 5, 12 to 15, and also Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 10 to 12. And it was also a sign that Jehovah was Israel's God. And we see that in Ezekiel 20, verse 20. So every reason given for the observance of the Sabbath has relevance only to Israel, not to the Gentiles or to the church. It is purely for Israel. Now, the Sabbath also, it's not a creation ordinance. What does that mean? It means it did not begin at creation. It began only with Moses, and down in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, it just states simply that what God did on that day. It just says he rested, but there was no command to observe that day. In fact, the word Sabbath is not even used in the Genesis account. And that day of the week is just called the seventh day. So from Adam to Moses, there's no record of anyone keeping the Sabbath. While God did list a number of obligations upon humanity in the previous covenants, keeping the Sabbath was not one of them. And in fact, the book of Job deals with a pre-Mosaic saint, he's pre-Moses, and it too mentions many obligations man had toward God, but again, Sabbath was not there. Sabbath observance begins with Moses in Exodus chapter 16, verse 23 to 30, and it was made part of the law of Moses in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. Now, the Sabbath, what is it? It's a day of rest. It was not a day of corporate worship. And that's a very common misconception today. Today, people believe that if we keep the Sabbath, we need to go and go to church and have a worship time. Not so. As the Sabbath commandment was further developed in other parts of the law of Moses, what was meant by resting on the Sabbath day was mainly a matter of prohibition. No gathering of manna, which was one of them, which we see in Exodus 16, 23 to 30. No traveling, so you couldn't get a little excursion, Exodus 16, 29. No kindling of fire, Exodus 35, 3, and no gathering of wood, we see in Numbers 15, 32. And there are other Sabbath restrictions which we see in Amos, for instance, which was no trading, no business, Jeremiah 17, 21, no burden bearing, and Nehemiah, there was no, you couldn't open your market on that day. Nothing at all was said about corporate worship. In the law of Moses, the Sabbath was a day of rest, and you were meant to cease all labor. It was never a day of corporate worship. In fact, the Sabbath synagogue services found in the New Testament originated with the Babylonian captivity, not with the law of Moses. So while it was not a day of total inactivity, it was supposed to be a day of rest and refreshment from the regular work of the other 6 days. So while the rest itself may have been an act of worship, corporate worship on the Sabbath was not a factor in the Old Testament. And even Leviticus 23:3 states concerning the Sabbath that it is a Sabbath unto Jehovah in all your dwellings. So it has to do here with staying at home. That's where you practiced the Sabbath rest, was at home, not at church. And resting, it was resting as a family rather than getting together in corporate worship. Now, the penalty for profaning the Sabbath was death. To profane the Sabbath was to consider it just like any other day. So on the Sabbath day, they were to do no labor, and they were to stay home and rest. How wonderful to stay home and rest for a whole day. Now, the Sabbath also was a token or sign of the Mosaic Covenant. And again, it was intended for Israel only and not the church. As a sign of the Mosaic Covenant, it is in force as long as the Mosaic Covenant is in force. If the Mosaic Covenant comes to an end, so would mandatory Sabbath keeping come to an end. What's the purposes of the law? Now, straight up, the Mosaic law was never a means of salvation. If it was a means of salvation, it would mean that it would be salvation by works, and salvation was and always is by grace through faith. No other way. Now, while the content of faith has changed from age to age, depending on where we are in the revelation, the means of salvation never ever changes. So the law was not given to serve as a means of salvation, and we see that in Romans chapter 3, verse 20 and verse 28. Also Galatians chapter 2, verse 16, and chapter 3, verse 11 and verse 21. It was given to a people who were already redeemed from Egypt. It was not done in order to redeem them. They were already a redeemed people. Now, there are several purposes for the giving of the law. and we can find them in both testaments. There are at least 9 purposes. The first purpose was to reveal the holiness of God and to reveal the standard of righteousness that God demanded for a proper relationship with him. And we see that in Leviticus 11:44 and 19, verse 1 to 2 and verse 37. Also 1 Peter 1, verse 15 to 16. Paul in Romans 7:12 says the law itself was holy and righteous and good. So the second purpose of the law was to provide the rule of conduct for the Old Testament saint. For example, in Romans chapter 3, verse 28, it makes it clear that no man was justified by the works of the law. The law always had purposes other than being a means of salvation. And what we see here is that it provided the rule of life for the Old Testament believer. For the Old Testament believer, the law was the center of his spiritual life and his delight, as we see in Psalm 119, especially verses 77, 97, 103, 104, and 159. So it was a rule of life for them. It also provided occasions for individual and corporate worship for Israel. For instance, we see in Leviticus 23, we have 7 holy seasons of Israel. That's one example. The fourth purpose was to keep the Jews a distinct people from all the nations around about them. Again, we see this in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44 to 45, Deuteronomy 7, verse 6, and Deuteronomy 14, 1 to 2. So this was the specific reason for many of the laws, such as the dietary laws, clothing laws. It was to keep the Jews a distinct people from the nations around them. Yeah. Now, as we said, there are some of the other ways that they are distinct is along with their worship habits, was their eating habits. Leviticus 11, their sexual habits. Leviticus 12, their clothing habits, and even the way that they cut their beards. So we see most of that in Leviticus. Now, in relation to Gentiles, the law of Moses served as the middle wall of petition. And we see that in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11 to 16. Now, we know that God made 4 unconditional covenants with Israel. These are the 4 Jewish covenants made with Israel. And God's blessings, both physical and spiritual, are mediated through these 4 unconditional covenants. And these are called the covenants of promise, which we see in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12. Now, because of the Jewish nature of these unconditional covenants, a conditional covenant was also added, which is the one we're dealing with today, the Mosaic Covenant. And this one contained the law of Moses. Now, it's the law of commandments contained in ordinances in verse 15 of Ephesians 2. So the purpose of the Mosaic law, the Mosaic Covenant, was to become the middle wall of petition to keep Gentiles as Gentiles away from enjoying the spiritual blessings of the Jewish people of the unconditional covenants. So the Mosaic law kept Gentiles as Gentiles away from enjoying the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. And because of this purpose, Gentiles were both now alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and also they were strangers from the covenants of promise, which means all the blessings. The only way Gentiles could enjoy the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants during the period of the Mosaic law was to take upon themselves the obligation of the law, undergo the rite of circumcision, and then live like every Jew had to live. But Gentiles as Gentiles could not enjoy the Jewish spiritual blessings. Only Gentiles as proselytes to Mosaic Judaism could. Another purpose for the Mosaic law was to to reveal sin. And three passages in the book of Romans point this out. Romans chapter 3, verse 19 to 20, where Paul emphasized that there is no justification through the law. By means of the law, this is Mosaic law, no Jewish person will ever be justified. That's declared righteous before God. So what is the law then? If it's not a way of justification, if it's not a way of salvation, well, what is it? The law was given to provide the knowledge of sin, to reveal exactly what sin is. In Romans chapter 5, verse 20, it says that the law was given so that trespasses might be made very clear. How does one know he has sinned? Well, because the law spells out what he can and can't do. And so the law with its 613 commandments actually revealed sin. A third passage in Romans is Romans 7, verse 7. Again, Paul here emphasizes the fact the law was given, Mosaic law was given so that sin might be made known. And Paul became aware of his sinful state by looking into the law, into the 613 commandments, and knowing that on the basis of the law, he fell short. So the seventh purpose is to make one sin more. Now, Romans 4:15 states that for the law works wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there transgression. And Paul adds in Romans 5, verse 20, it says the law came in besides that the trespass might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did abound more exceedingly. So the picture Paul gives here is that the law, Mosaic law, came in to cause more sin. It actually came in to make one sin more. And how this works is explained by Paul in Romans chapter 7, 7 to 13, and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 46. 1 Corinthians 56 reads, the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. So basically, what Paul taught here is that the sin nature, it needs a base of operation from which to work from. The sin nature now uses the law as a base of operation. So when Paul said, where there is no law, neither is there transgression, he didn't mean, of course, that there was no sin before the law was given. The term transgression here, it means that it's a specific type of sin. So it means that it's a violation of a specific command. So men were sinners before the law was given, but they were not transgressors of the law until the law was given, because now we have certain laws. Here they are. If I break one, I've now transgressed. Where those laws weren't there before, I couldn't transgress because I didn't know what the law was. So once the law was given, the sin nature now uses the law as a base of operation. And what that does, it says, the law says, you will not do this. And the sin nature says, oh, yes, I will. And the law says, you will do this. And sin nature says, no, I won't. That's the sin nature. That's how it operates. The eighth purpose of the law was to show the sinner that there was nothing he could do on his own to please God. He had no ability to keep the law perfectly or to attain the righteousness of the law. And Paul tells us that in Romans 7, verses 14 to 25. And this led to the ninth purpose, which was to drive one to faith. And we see that in Romans chapter 8, verses 1 to 4. And also Galatians chapter 3, 24 to 25. So the final purpose of the law was to bring one to saving faith in the Messiah. So the purposes of the law can be categorized in four aspects. First of all, in relation to God, it was to reveal his holiness and to reveal his righteous standards. These are my standards, he says, written down for you. Second, in relation to Israel, it was to keep Israel a distinct people and to provide a rule of life for the Old Testament saint and to provide for individual and corporate worship. And third, in relation to Gentiles, it's to serve as a middle wall of petition and to keep them strangers to the unconditional Jewish covenant so as they could not partake of Jewish spiritual blessings as Gentiles, but only as proselytes to Mosaic Judaism. And fourth, in relation to sin, it was to reveal what and show what sin is, and to make one sin more, to show that a man simply cannot attain the righteousness of the law on his own. And it's to drive one to faith in Messiah. Now, the status of the covenant, it was the basis for the dispensation of the law. Now, it was the one Jewish covenant that was conditional, and it ultimately came to an end with the death of the Messiah. And we see this in Romans 10:4, 2 Corinthians 3:3-11, Galatians 3:19-29, Ephesians 2:11-18, Hebrews 7:11-12, and verse 18. So, Mosaic law is no longer in effect. Now, prophetically, it was already considered broken even before Messiah died to free the Jew from the penalty of the law, because Jeremiah 31:32 speaks about this. Now, the status of the covenant. Now, two factors which have developed in the minds and teachings of many believers, which have contributed to a great deal of confusion over the law of Moses. And one of them is the practice of dividing the law into ceremonial, legal, and moral commandments. And so what they do is, on the basis of this division, many have now come to think, well, the believer, is free from the ceremonial and the legal commandments, but is still under the moral commandments. And then that's the first thing. And the second thing is to believe that the 10 commandments are still valid today, while the other 603 commandments are not. So both of those are false. They are misconceptions. They're false. We need to understand that the Mosaic law is viewed by the scriptures as a single unit. In fact, the word Torah, meaning law, is always singular when applied to the law of Moses. Even though it contains 613 commandments, it's a unit. The same is true of the Greek word nomos in the New Testament. The division of the law of Moses into those three sections, ceremonial, legal, and moral, it's convenient for the study of different types of commandments contained within it. But it is never divided this way by the scriptures themselves. It is always seen as a unit. And neither is there any spiritual basis for separating the 10 commandments away from the whole 613 and making only the 10 commandments perpetual. All 613 commandments are a single unit comprising the law of Moses. Now, it's the principle of the unity of the law of Moses that lies behind the statement found in James chapter 2, verse 10. James writes, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law, all 613, and yet stumble in one point, he has become guilty of breaking all the laws." A person needs only to break one of the 630 commandments to be guilty of breaking all of the law of Moses. So this can only be true if the Mosaic law is a unit. If it is not, the guilt lies only in the particular commandment being violated, not in the whole law. So if one breaks a legal commandment, for instance, he's also guilty of breaking the ceremonial and moral commandments. The same is true of breaking a moral commandment or a ceremonial commandment. You're guilty of breaking the whole lot. You're guilty of breaking the 10 commandments as well. So the law, it's a unit. To break one of the 613 commandments is to break them all. Now, we need to have a clear understanding of the law of Moses and its relationship to the believer, Jewish or Gentile. We need to then view it as the scriptures view it, which is a unit that cannot be divided into parts that have been done away with and parts that have not been done away with. Nor can certain commandments be separated in such a way as to give them a different status from other commandments. They're all the same. Now, the law of Moses has been rendered inoperative. And this is the very clear teaching of the New Testament. It has been rendered inoperative with the death of the Messiah, of Jesus. In other words, the law in its totality no longer has authority over any individual, Jew or Gentile. And this is evident from a number of passages. And the first one we see here is Romans chapter 7, verses 5 to 6. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were through the law wrought in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we have been discharged from the law, having died to that wherein we were held, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit, not in oldness of the letter. Now in verses 1 to 3, Paul says, so then if while the husband lives, she be joined to another man, she should be called an adulteress. But if the husband die, she is free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be joined to another man. So what he's saying here, the wife was freed from the law because a death had taken place. Verse 4, wherefore, my brethren, you also were made dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you should be joined to another, even to him who was raised from the dead, that we might bring forth fruit unto God. So believers are dead to the law, Mosaic law, through the body of Messiah. In verse 6, but now we have been discharged from the law, having died to that wherein we were held, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit and not in oldness of the letter. So Paul declares that the believer has been discharged from the law. And the Greek word is katargeo, which means to render inoperative. The law, Mosaic law, has been rendered inoperative insofar as being the rule of life over the believer. The second passage we see is Romans 10:4, where it says, for Christ is the end of the law unto righteousness to everyone that believes. And the Greek word for end is telos, and can either mean termination or goal. However, the evidence clearly favors the meaning of end as termination. Now, other scriptures teach both truths. They teach the Messiah as the goal of the law, but he's also the termination of the law. Since the Messiah is the end of the law, this means that there's no justification through it. And we see that in Galatians chapter 2, verse 16. This, of course, was always true, but furthermore, there's no sanctification or perfection through Mosaic law. And Hebrews chapter 7, verse 19 tell us that. So it should be very evident that the law has come to an end in the Messiah and cannot function in either justification or sanctification. For the believer especially, it has now been rendered inoperative. The third thing we see is that the law was never ever meant to be a permanent administration, but it was meant to be a temporary one. And this is stated for us very clearly in Galatians 3:19. Galatians 3:19, Paul writes this, what then is the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise has been made. So in this context, Paul stated that the law of Moses was an addition to the Abrahamic covenant, which we see in verses 15 to 18 of Galatians 3. It was added for the purpose of making sin very clear, so that all will know that they have fallen short of God's standard of righteousness. It was a temporary addition until the seed, who's the seed? The Messiah would come. Now that he has come, the law is finished. The addition has ceased to function with the cross. Now, the fourth thing is that with the Messiah, there is now a new priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, not according to the order of Aaron. Now, we have to remember that the law of Moses provided the basis for the Levitical priesthood, and there was an inseparable connection between the law of Moses and the Levitical priesthood. So, Jesus is not from the tribe of Levi, he's from the tribe of Judah. A new priesthood now required a new law under which it could operate according to Hebrews chapter 7, verse 11 to 18. And the point made in Hebrews 7, 11 to 12 is that under the law, only one type of priesthood was permitted, and that was the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priesthood could not bring perfection. And this we see in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 to chapter 10, verse 18. And it states very clearly that animal blood could not bring perfection. Only the Messiah's blood could do that. So the Mosaic law was the basis for the Levitical priesthood. For the Levitical priesthood to be done away with and to be replaced by a new priesthood, the priesthood of Melchizedek, it required a change of law. Could not operate under the Mosaic system of law. As long as the law of Moses was in effect, no other priesthood was valid except the Aaronic or Levitical priesthood. And we see that in this passage of Hebrews 7. Was there a change of law? Hebrews 7:18 states that the Mosaic law was disannulled because it is no longer in effect. There is now a new priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. So if the Mosaic law were still in effect, Jesus could not function as a priest. Because the Mosaic law is no longer in effect, Jesus can be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So law of Moses has been disannulled in favor of a new law, which is the basis for the priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, the writer of Hebrews goes on to say that the above truth was already anticipated by the prophets. We see this in Hebrews 8, verse 8 to 13. In Hebrews 8, 8 to 12, he quotes the new covenant of Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34. And then he concludes in verse 13 in that he says, a new covenant he has made the first old. But that which is becoming old and waxed aged is nigh unto vanishing away, talking about the Mosaic covenant. So the law of Moses became old with Jeremiah, and it vanished away with the Messiah's death. Now, the sixth thing we see, we spoke briefly before, was the law was the middle wall of petition that was now broken down according to Ephesians 2, 14 to 15. For he is our peace, who made both one and broke down the middle wall of petition, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, that he might create in himself of the two one new man, so making peace. So, as we saw earlier, God made 4 unconditional eternal covenants with Israel. All of God's blessings, both material and spiritual, are mediated by means of these 4 Jewish covenants. God also had a 5th covenant, which was temporary and conditional, and that was the Mosaic covenant that contained the Mosaic law. And it was this Mosaic law that served as the middle wall of petition to keep Gentiles as Gentiles away from enjoying Jewish spiritual blessings. If the Mosaic law were still in effect today, it would still be a wall of petition to keep the Gentiles away. But this wall of petition was broken down with the death of the Messiah. And since the wall of petition was the Mosaic law, this meant that the law of Moses was now done away with. Gentiles as Gentiles, on the basis of faith, can and do enjoy Jewish spiritual blessings by becoming fellow partakers of the promise in the Messiah. 7th line of evidence for the annulment of the Mosaic law is based in Galatians 3:23 to Galatians 4, verse 7. In this passage, the law is looked upon as a pedagogue or a tutor over a minor, a child, to bring him to mature faith in the Messiah. Having become a believer, he is no longer under this tutor, which is the law of Moses. As clearly as it could be stated, this passage teaches that with the Messiah's coming, the law is no longer in effect. 8th line of evidence for the annulment of the Mosaic law we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 to 11. And that zeroes right in on the part of the law that most people want to retain, and that is the 10 Commandments. First of all, one needs to see what Paul is saying concerning the law of Moses here. In verses 3 and 7 of 2 Corinthians 3, the spotlight is on the 10 commandments. Why? Because it says that they were engraved on stones. These were the only ones engraved on stones. In verse 7, it's called the ministration of death. In verse 9, it's called the ministration of condemnation. Negative, but valid descriptions. The main point here is then that the law of Moses, especially represented by the 10 commandments, is a ministration of death and a ministration of condemnation. So if the 10 commandments were still in force today, this would still be true. However, they are no longer in force, for it states here in verses 7 and 11 that the law has passed away. Here, this is that Greek word kategeo, which means to render inoperative. And since the emphasis on this passage is on the 10 commandments, this means that the 10 commandments have passed away. And the thrust here is very clear. The law of Moses, and especially the 10 commandments, is no longer in effect. In fact, the superiority of the law of the Messiah is seen by the fact that it will never be rendered inoperative. Now, to summarize this, the law is a unit comprised of 613 commandments, and all of it has been rendered inoperative with the death of Messiah. There is no commandment that has continued beyond the cross of Messiah. The law is there and can be used as a teaching tool to show God's standard of righteousness, as well as man's sinfulness and need of a substitutionary atonement. It can be used to teach lots of spiritual truths about God, about God as a man, Jesus. Now, it can be used to point one to Messiah, Galatians 3:23-25. However, it has completely ceased to function as an authority over the individual. It is no longer the rule of life for believers. Now, the third point here has to do with the moral law in regard to the status of the Mosaic Covenant. What about the moral law? This is the part of the law of Moses that many people try to retain and therefore conclude the law of Moses is still in effect. However, we need to cast our mind right back to the beginning and realize that the moral law preceded the law of Moses. The moral law is not identical to the law of Moses. Why? Because Adam and Eve broke the moral law long before Moses, and Satan broke the moral law before Adam. So the law of Moses embodied the moral law, but it did not originate the moral law. It was previous to that. Now, simply the moral law is embodied within the law of Moses, and currently it's now embodied within the law of Messiah. Now, in Matthew chapter 5, 17-18, people use this as an objection to the termination of the law of Moses. This is Jesus' statement here. He says, "Think not that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass away from the law, till all things be accomplished." Jesus was here speaking about the law of Moses, but people use this passage. They never accept their own thesis here, since they must believe in the doing away in some form of many of the commandments of the law of Moses, if not most. Here, for example, the commandments concerning priesthood and sacrifice done away with. Other examples include the food laws and clothing laws. They're all done away with. But in actual fact, the Mosaic law is a unit. Now, it's a unit. You can't just do away some and not all. If by the law of Moses that they're talking about, that they use this for here, they mean only the moral commandments, then this passage doesn't prove it at all. Verse 19 here adds these least commandments. which includes more than merely the moral commandments. And the emphasis here is on the entire law, all 613 commandments. Verse 19 reads, "Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men, so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Verse 19, need to keep that in focus here. It's true, Jesus did come to fulfill the law. But the law of Moses did not end with the coming of Messiah or by his life. It ended with his death. And Jesus is very much alive. As long as he was alive, he was under the Mosaic law, and he had to fulfill and obey every commandment applicable to him. He's the one speaking this, not in the way that he has to fulfill them in the way the Mosaic law says, not in the way that the rabbis reinterpreted it. So the statement of Matthew 5:17 to 19 was made while Jesus was alive. And even while he was living, he already implied the doing away with the law, because one example of this we see in Mark chapter 7, verse 19, where this, he said, making all meats clean. But Mosaic law didn't make all meats clean. But Jesus is saying, well, it's going to be done away with. Okay. So have they done away with it or not? To constantly claim that the law of Moses is still in effect, or that it is the same as the law of Messiah, while ignoring the details of the same law, is inconsistent and it's false. Now, as for the meaning of the word fulfill, the Greek term is consistently used by Matthew in his gospel in reference to fulfilling prophecy, and so bringing it to an end. And Matthew chapter 1, 22 to 23 states that the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14 was fulfilled. That this brought the prophecy to an end, and so nothing in the future will fulfill it. So to fulfill meant to accomplish what prophecy demanded, while to abolish meant to fail to accomplish it. So Jesus fulfilled the law by his life. He took upon himself the curse and penalty of the law, and he died a penal substitutionary death, and so brought the law to an end. Now, the fifth point here is that in the status of the Mosaic Covenant is that the law of Moses has been disannulled, and believers are now under a new law. The new law is called the law of Christ in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, and it's called the law of the Spirit of life in Romans chapter 8, verse 2. This is a brand new law, totally separate from the law of Moses. The law of Messiah contains all the individual commandments from the Messiah and the apostles that are applicable to a New Testament believer. And we're going to look into this when we get to the New Covenant. Now, the sixth point made here in the status of the covenant is that the believer in the Messiah is now free from the law of Moses. This means that he is free from the necessity of keeping any commandment of that system. On the other hand, he is also free to keep parts of the law of Moses if he wants to. Nothing to stop him. The biblical basis for this freedom to keep the law can be seen in Paul. Yeah, Paul was the greatest exponent of freedom from the law, but yet we see him taking a vow in Acts chapter 18, verse 18, and that's based upon Numbers chapter 6, verse 2, verse 5, and verse 9, and verse 18. His desire to be in Jerusalem for Pentecost in Acts 20, verse 16 is based upon Deuteronomy 16:16, to be there for the feast. And the strongest passage we see is Acts 21, 17 to 26, where we see again Paul himself, the apostle of freedom from the law, keeping the law, where he takes on the vow with some other men in the temple. The believer is free from the law, but he's also free to keep parts of it if he desires. So, if a Jewish believer, for instance, he wants to not eat bacon, well, he's free to do so. If he wants to eat bacon, he's free to do so. The same is true for all the other commandments. However, there are two dangers that must be avoided by any believer who volunteers to keep the commandments of the law of Moses. And one danger is the idea that by keeping the law of Moses, he's somehow contributing to his own justification and sanctification. That's false. Now, the second danger is also in one's expecting others to keep the same commandments he has decided to keep. Equally wrong. That's legalism. The one who exercises his freedom to keep the law must also recognize and respect another's freedom not to keep it. Now, the seventh point of the status of the Mosaic Covenant is that the Sabbath was the sign, the seal, and the token of the Mosaic Covenant. As long as that covenant was in effect, the Sabbath law was mandatory. Since the law of Moses has been rendered inoperative, then the Sabbath command no longer applies. So those who have an inconsistent insistence that the law of Moses is still in effect also insist that the Sabbath law applies. However, they totally ignore what Moses wrote about how to keep the Sabbath, and they actually go so far as to even change the day of the week, something that the law of Moses does not allow. Many Jewish believers also insist on mandatory Sabbath keeping, though they inconsistently base it on the law of Moses, right? At least they retain it within the seventh day of the week. So the reasons used for mandatory Sabbath keeping are almost exclusively based upon the Old Testament for obvious reasons, because there's nothing in the New Testament. There's no New Testament command for believers in general or Jewish believers in particular to keep the Sabbath. The claim that Sabbath observance is part of the New Covenant is nowhere supported by the New Covenant scriptures themselves. In fact, if anything, they teach the opposite. And that, friends, is the Mosaic Covenant. Next week we'll carry on. Next time we'll carry on with the Land Covenant and the remainder of the covenants. That's our contact details there.